Hen, you got the keys in the car?
Speeds are 60 miles an hour. You guys tell your license, man.
I think he's coming. I think this car, man. He's coming, he's coming.
The night of April 29th, 2025, started the way a lot of nights do on the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn. Traffic. Lights reflecting off the pavement. Officers on patrol, doing what they do. But by the time that night was over, a 28-year-old man named Jumaane Wright was dead. Shot once by a police lieutenant on a highway overpass in East New York. His Porsche still running when it finally crashed into an NYPD vehicle a mile down the road. And what happened next? The body cam footage, the Attorney General's investigation, the questions that still haven't been answered, is a story about accountability, transparency, and what we demand from law enforcement when a life ends on a public road. Before we go any further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love knowing where our audience is. And if you believe that every police-involved death deserves a full, transparent, independent investigation, like this video and subscribe. Because that's exactly what this channel is about. Jumaane Wright was 28 years old. He was from Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, a small, quiet suburb just north of Philadelphia. A place where most people know their neighbors, where kids grow up fast, and where the distance between ambition and opportunity can sometimes feel impossibly wide. On the night he died, Jumaane was behind the wheel of a Porsche. Not his Porsche. Police would later say the car had been reported stolen out of Pennsylvania, and that the license plates on it didn't match the vehicle. He had a passenger with him. He was on the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn, one of New York City's most heavily traveled roads, moving through the city at night. He was also, according to court records, on federal probation. His conviction: interstate transport of stolen vehicles, moving cars from Pennsylvania into New York. It was a pattern that had already brought him into the criminal justice system once before. On this night, it would bring him into contact with the NYPD's community response team, and it would be the last contact he ever had with anyone. The NYPD's community response team isn't a unit most people outside New York have heard of. But inside the department, it's one of the more specialized patrol units, a plainclothes team focused on crime suppression in high-impact areas. On the night of April 29th, members of that team were on the Belt Parkway near Brighton Beach, in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn. Routine patrol. Watching traffic. Looking for anything that stood out. And something did stand out. A Porsche. Moving through traffic. And when an officer ran the plates through the system, what came back was a flag. The vehicle had been reported stolen in Pennsylvania. The stop was initiated just after 8 p.m. near Cropsey Avenue. Officers signaled the Porsche to pull over. Standard protocol. Lights. A clear signal to stop. Jumaane Wright did not stop. Instead, he drove off the parkway, accelerated, and got back on the Belt Parkway heading eastbound, away from the officers, deeper into Brooklyn, pushing his speed higher. Here is where the NYPD's own policy enters the story. Earlier in 2025, the department had updated its pursuit policy. In a city of 8 million people, with pedestrians, cyclists, and other drivers on every block, high-speed vehicle pursuits had been identified as one of the leading causes of civilian death and injury during police interactions. The new protocol was direct. Unless the pursuit involved a serious or violent felony, officers were not to chase. A stolen car, even one with non-matching plates, even one being driven by someone with a federal record, did not meet that threshold. So the officers who first attempted the stop did not pursue. Instead, they did exactly what the policy required. They broadcast the vehicle description to other units. They shared the direction of travel. And they let the net close from a different direction. In the adjoining precinct, officers received the transmission. A Porsche. Stolen. Eastbound on the belt. Moving fast. They set up a roadblock. Exit 13. A stretch of the Belt Parkway in East New York, one of the borough's oldest, most layered neighborhoods, a place where highways cut through communities and where the sound of traffic never really stops. Officers positioned themselves across the road. They directed other vehicles to stop, to turn off their engines, to get out of the way. One of those officers was a man named Hen, whose body camera would later capture what happened next in excruciating, second-by-second detail. Officer Hen's footage shows the roadblock. Cars stopped. Lights flashing. The road ahead temporarily cleared. Officers in position. And then the Porsche. It came fast. The body camera footage, released months later by the New York State Attorney General's office, shows the Porsche accelerating toward the roadblock rather than slowing. Officers moved. One lieutenant was directly in its path. According to NYPD Chief of Department John Chell, who briefed reporters at the scene after midnight, the Porsche swerved, either clipping or nearly clipping the lieutenant who was standing in the road. The accounts differ slightly depending on who is telling the story. What is not disputed is what happened in the next fraction of a second. The lieutenant fired. One shot. It struck Jumaane Wright. The Porsche didn't stop immediately. It kept moving, one more mile, one more exit, all the way to Pennsylvania Avenue, where it finally crashed into an NYPD vehicle and came to rest. Officers moved in. They found Jumaane Wright inside the car, critically wounded. They started performing life-saving measures immediately, chest compressions, emergency care, everything in the protocol. The passenger was taken into custody. An ambulance came. Wright was transported to Brookdale Hospital. He was pronounced dead. We're going to pause here, because this is the moment where the facts stop and the questions begin. And the questions matter. They matter for Jumaane Wright's family. They matter for every New Yorker who drives on the Belt Parkway. And they matter for every police department in America that is trying to figure out when force is justified and when it goes too far. Do you think the officer who fired was justified? Drop your honest answer in the comments. We're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to give you the full picture. The New York State Attorney General's Office of Special Investigation, known as OSI, exists for exactly this kind of moment. In 2021, New York State passed a law requiring that all deaths resulting from police action be investigated by an independent office, separate from the department involved. The law was a direct response to years of criticism that police departments could not reliably investigate themselves, that the culture of law enforcement made internal accountability nearly impossible. OSI is that external check. It has subpoena power. It operates independently. And when a police officer fires a weapon and someone dies, OSI opens an investigation. Not as punishment. Not as accusation. As process. Within days of Jumaane Wright's death on April 29, 2025, OSI announced it was opening an investigation. That investigation is still ongoing. Months after the shooting, in December 2025, Attorney General Letitia James made a decision that would significantly shape the public's understanding of what happened on Exit 13. Her office released the body camera footage. 2 cameras. 2 perspectives. 2 officers whose bodies were recording everything in real time as Jumaane Wright's Porsche came toward the roadblock. The first camera belonged to Officer Gould. The timestamp on the footage reads April 29, 2025, 8:09 p.m. The camera appears to be mounted inside a vehicle. The footage shows the interior of a car, the dashboard, the world beyond the windshield in the gathering dusk. It is the kind of footage that is simultaneously mundane and haunting, the ordinary equipment of law enforcement, capturing an extraordinary and fatal moment. The second camera belonged to Officer Hen. His footage is shot from the roadblock itself, from the ground, from the position of a person standing on a highway, surrounded by other stopped vehicles, waiting. It shows the moment the Porsche came into view. It shows the seconds before the shot. Attorney General James was direct about why the footage was released. Her office had established a policy. Camera footage obtained during OSI investigations would be made public in order to increase transparency and strengthen trust. The language of the release was careful. The release, the AG's office stated, was not an expression of any opinion about the guilt or innocence of any party, or about whether any individual should be charged with a crime. The footage is evidence. The investigation is ongoing. The conclusion is not yet written. Public footage from police-involved shootings always exists in a complicated space. It shows what it shows. It does not show everything. Officer Hen's footage shows the roadblock. It shows officers directing traffic to stop. It shows the Porsche approaching at speed. It shows movement, officers moving out of the way, the chaos of a vehicle that is not slowing down, the seconds compressing into something that happens faster than thought. What it does not definitively show, what no single camera angle can definitively show, is whether the lieutenant was struck or nearly struck. Whether the Porsche's trajectory was intentional or the result of panic. Whether Jumaane Wright understood what was in front of him, or whether he was simply driving too fast to process what was happening in time to stop. These are the questions OSI is tasked with answering. These are the questions that will determine whether the lieutenant who fired acted within the bounds of lawful force, or whether a different decision was possible, a different outcome was achievable. There are facts in this case that are uncomfortable to hold at the same time, but they have to be held together if we're going to understand it honestly. Jumaane Wright was on federal probation for interstate transport of stolen vehicles. The car he was driving that night had been reported stolen in Pennsylvania. The plates on the car did not match the vehicle. These are not allegations. These are documented facts from the official record. And also, Jumaane Wright is dead. He was 28 years old. He was shot once on a highway by a police officer. And the circumstances of that shooting are still under independent investigation. Both of these things are true. And the legal question, the only question that ultimately matters in an OSI investigation, is not whether Jumaane Wright was doing something wrong. It is whether the officer who fired did so lawfully. In New York State, the use of deadly force by a police officer is lawful when an officer reasonably believes it is necessary to defend themselves or another person from imminent death or serious physical injury, or to stop a fleeing suspect who poses a significant threat of death or serious physical injury to others. A vehicle moving at speed toward a person standing in a road can, under the law, constitute an imminent threat. Whether it did in this case, whether the lieutenant's belief was reasonable, whether the threat was imminent, whether all other options were exhausted, is exactly what OSI is determining. There is something deeply uncomfortable embedded in the architecture of what happened that night. The officers who first spotted the Porsche did the right thing, by policy. They did not chase. They followed the protocol designed to prevent the kind of high-speed crashes that kill bystanders and civilians. But by not chasing, by instead setting up a roadblock, they created a different scenario. A scenario where a car moving at high speed encountered a wall of officers on a highway and had nowhere to go but through. This is not a criticism of the policy. High-speed pursuits kill people. The data is clear. Restricting them saves lives on net. But it raises a question that police departments across the country are grappling with. When you restrict one kind of force, you sometimes create the conditions for a different kind of force. When you can't chase, you stop. When you stop, you create a confrontation. And confrontations, especially on highways, especially at night, especially at speed, can end with someone dying. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. It should not be comfortable. Because Jumaane Wright is dead and nothing about that is comfortable. Here's a question I want to put to you directly. If a car is reported stolen, and the driver refuses to stop, and officers set up a roadblock, and the car drives toward officers, at what point does the use of deadly force become justified? And at what point does it become too much? There's no easy answer. But I want you to think about it. Drop your perspective in the comments. Because these are the conversations that change policy. These are the conversations that save lives. Jumaane Wright's family is from Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. A small community. A tight community. The kind of place where a death on a Brooklyn highway does not stay on the news cycle. It lives in the fabric of every ordinary day. In a chair at the dinner table. In a phone that stops ringing. In the particular silence that follows a loss that doesn't make sense yet. As of the time this script was written, the OSI investigation remains open. No charges have been filed against any officer. No final determination has been made about whether the shooting was lawful. The family is waiting. And waiting, in cases like this, is its own kind of suffering. Because the bureaucratic timeline of a government investigation does not match the emotional timeline of grief. Because every week that passes without an answer is another week of not knowing whether the person you loved died because of something that could have been prevented, whether justice, in whatever form it takes, is coming. Let's talk about what the Attorney General's office did that matters. Because it is genuinely significant, and it deserves to be recognized as such. AG Letitia James released the body camera footage. She didn't have to do it on that timeline. She didn't have to do it at all while the investigation is still open. But her office established a policy that says, when we obtain footage in the course of an OSI investigation, we release it publicly. Not because we've concluded anything. Because transparency is not a reward for good behavior. It is a baseline requirement in a society that asks its police to use force on its behalf. The release came with appropriate caveats. It is not a verdict. It is not a prosecution. It is footage. It is evidence. And it is now available for the public, including Jumaane Wright's family, including residents of the Belt Parkway corridor, including every person who wants to form their own view of what happened, to see for themselves. That is what accountability looks like in practice. Not perfect. Not complete. But real. Jumaane Wright's death did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a city where the relationship between black communities and law enforcement carries decades of history. History that is not abstract but lived, felt, remembered. It happened in a city that has spent the last decade implementing reforms designed to limit the conditions under which officers use force, and is still, in real time, figuring out what those reforms look like at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday night on the Belt Parkway when a stolen car won't stop. It happened in a country where 2025 saw hundreds of people killed by police, where the data on those killings consistently shows racial disparities that persist across departments, across cities, across policy regimes. And it happened to a young man who, whatever choices he made, whatever record he carried, was 28 years old. Was someone's son. Was a person whose life had a before and an after, and whose after ended on a highway in Brooklyn before he had a chance to build whatever came next. There are people who will watch this video and conclude that Jumaane Wright made choices that led to his death, that if you drive a stolen car, refuse to stop for police, and drive toward officers on a highway, you bear responsibility for what happens next. There are people who will watch this video and conclude that a 28-year-old man is dead for the crime of having a bad night, driving a stolen car, and panicking, and that the system that produced this outcome needs to be fundamentally reimagined. Both of those perspectives exist in the real world. Both of them are held by real people. And the hard work of a just society is not choosing one and ignoring the other. It is holding both simultaneously and asking, what system, what policy, what training, what culture would produce a different outcome? Not for every case. But for some. For the cases where death was preventable. The reason OSI matters, the reason independent investigation matters, is not because it always produces the result any particular side wants. It is because it produces a result that was not predetermined by the institution being investigated. When a police department investigates itself, there is a structural conflict of interest. Not because every officer is corrupt. Not because every supervisor looks the other way. But because the culture of any institution shapes what questions get asked and which ones don't. It shapes what evidence gets weighed heavily and what gets explained away. It shapes who gets believed. An external investigation does not solve this problem entirely. But it introduces a different set of pressures, a different set of accountability structures, a different standard for what constitutes a full and honest accounting. That is what is happening with Jumaane Wright's death. And that investigation, however it concludes, is more valuable than any investigation the NYPD could have conducted on its own. There is a version of the conversation about police accountability where body cameras are the answer. Where footage solves everything. Where if we can just see what happened, we'll know who was right and who was wrong. The footage from April 29, 2025 shows us that this version is too simple. The footage matters. It is evidence. It is real. It shows things that cannot be disputed: the positioning of officers, the speed of the vehicle, the chaos of a roadblock on a highway at night. Without the footage, we would be choosing between competing narratives with no way to adjudicate. But the footage doesn't tell us everything. It doesn't tell us what Jumaane Wright was thinking in those final seconds. It doesn't tell us whether the threat to the lieutenant was as imminent as it appeared. It doesn't tell us whether a different decision, a slightly different position, a slightly different instruction, a slightly earlier radio call, might have produced a different outcome. Body cameras are not a verdict. They are a window. And what we do with what we see through that window is still entirely up to us. As of the recording of this video, the Office of Special Investigation is still examining the death of Jumaane Wright. The body camera footage is public. The facts of that night are documented. But the legal conclusion, whether what happened on exit 13 of the Belt Parkway on April 29, 2025 was lawful or unlawful, has not yet been reached. Jumaane Wright's family is still waiting. The lieutenant who fired is still on the force, as far as public record indicates. And the questions this case raises, about pursuit policy, about roadblocks, about the use of force to stop a vehicle, about what we owe to the public and what we owe to the people who police that public, are alive and unsettled. That is the honest answer. We don't always get neat endings. We don't always get justice that looks the way we imagine it. Sometimes accountability is slow, messy, incomplete. But it is better than silence. And it is better than a world where no one investigates at all. If this story moved you, here is what we ask. Subscribe, so you don't miss the next investigation. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And drop a comment, not just about what you think happened, but about what you think should change. What policy reform would prevent the next Jumaane Wright? What does accountability look like to you? What do you want from the system that is supposed to protect you? Because this channel exists because those questions matter. Because the people who died in these encounters deserve to be more than headlines. Because the families waiting for answers deserve to know that the public is watching. We're not stopping until every death at the hands of law enforcement receives the full, transparent, independent investigation it deserves. Until body camera footage is a baseline expectation, not an exception. Until the families waiting for answers don't have to wait in silence. Jumaane Wright was 28 years old. He was from Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. He died on the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn on April 29, 2025. His name deserves to be said out loud. His story deserves to be told fully. And what happened to him deserves a complete and honest answer.